All right, so yesterday we had a pretty massive upset for that special election that was taking place up in Alaska, where it appears like Sarah Palin has officially been taken down, at least for the time being. So we're going to get to some details here with this Guardian article, but I think that this is really interesting for a number of different reasons. Number one, kind of plays into the narrative that Democrats are seeing somewhat of a political resurgence in the wake of Roe v. Wade being overturned, as well as like a handful of victories being strung together here by Joe Biden and Democrats. And so it does seem like the winds are at least shifting a little bit right now nationally in terms of what is likely to happen in the midterms. But at the same time, there's a lot of caveats to that. And this is the other interesting part, is that Alaska has ranked choice voting. And so that pretty much played a direct role in the reason why this Democrat here, Mary Peltola, was able to pull off this upset victory. So here from The Guardian, they say Sarah Palin loses Alaska race to Democrat Mary Peltola. So a little bit of details here. They say the Democrat Mary Peltola has won the special election for Alaska's only U.S. House seat, becoming the first Alaska native to serve in the House after beating candidates including the Republican Sarah Palin. And they say that Peltola, who's 49, and is also Yupik, which is this native population within Alaska, is also the first woman to hold the seat and the first from her party to gain the seat in more than a half century. And during the campaign, she emphasized her support for such issues as abortion rights, and she will serve the remaining months of the late Republican U.S. Representative Don Young's term until a general election in November. So, Democrats are probably going to be coming out and wildly celebrating this, but again, you kind of have to hold your nose for a little bit, because the election in November is still going to be happening between the same three candidates here that were involved in this race. And so she's only going to be holding this seat, or at least have the seat secured for the next 3 months, basically. So, it's a temporary victory, but again, says something broader about the winds of what's happening in the country right now. But they say that Palin, the state's former governor, had the backing of Donald Trump and was hoping to make a political comeback. Didn't work out for her, obviously, but along with Peltola and the other Republican candidate, Nick Becich, she will run again for a 2-year term in November. And they say, how much did Peltola win by? The race was determined by a ranked choice voting tabulation, putting the Democrat in first place with 51.5% to Palin's 48.5%. And so we're going to get to a couple of absolutely delusional conservative responses to the idea of having ranked choice voting. And then we're going to get to a little bit of a actual statistical breakdown in terms of how she pulled this off. So of course, here we have Tom Cotton, one of the most insane reactionary fascist members of the Senate from Arkansas, and he said ranked choice voting is a scam to rig elections. Okay, so he thinks it's rigging elections to have a more democratic system where people can vote their preference and then put a second choice that their vote goes to if their preferred candidate doesn't win that election. This is just talking about a more democratic representation of what people actually want to see in the state of Alaska. And he's saying that it's rigging the election somehow. But he says that 60% of Alaska voters voted for a Republican, but thanks to a convoluted process and ballot exhaustion, which disenfranchises voters, a Democrat won the election. So she did win the election, and she won it pretty much outright. But here we get into some of the actual data on this in terms of how this ranked choice voting process played out. So I did the math behind the scenes. You're going to have to trust me a little bit on this. But basically, they point out here that in round one, you had Peltola, and this is the first choice vote. So when you're going to do or participate in a ranked choice voting system, you put your first choice, and then you put your second choice. And basically, if your preferred candidate that you put on your first choice doesn't end up in the first or second place, then they retabulate the votes, and your second choice candidate, your vote basically gets counted for them in the second round. So here in the first round, we had Mary Peltola with 74,807 first choice votes, and then you had this guy Becich down here with 52,504 votes, and then you had Sarah Palin down here with 58,328 votes. So these two candidates, Mary Peltola and Sarah Palin, were obviously the top two candidates. Then you go to the second round here, and this is where it sort of gets interesting and kind of implodes the idea that Tom Cotton was trying to put forward there, that this is somehow undemocratic, or that it's rigging the election in some way. But here you see that in the second choice voting tabulation, so you had Becich, because he was in third place, his votes then got split off to Palin and Peltola. and they say that 15,445 of Becic voters put Peltola as their number 2 pick. So that's a pretty substantial amount of basically these like establishment Republicans who ended up choosing the Democrat over the Trump-endorsed Sarah Palin. So again, you're seeing like kind of a split here between establishment Republicans who are currently at war with the Trump base of the Republican Party. But 15,445 of them picked Peltola as their second place candidate, and that led to her having 91,206 votes in the final tabulation. And you had 27,042 of them picking Sarah Palin as their number 2 pick, so obviously more than Peltola, but still not enough. And that led with Sarah Palin having 85,987 votes. And then you had, on top of these 2 picks, you also had 11,222 people who picked no one or picked a write-in candidate that had been eliminated as their second choice pick in this process. So this is where it kind of gets interesting, right? Because if you had those 11,000 people who didn't put a second place pick, or they did a write-in candidate or whatever the fuck, if you would have had every single one of these 11,000 people vote for Sarah Palin as their second choice pick, then she would have won this election, right? But if you actually do the math, and you're gonna have to trust me on this, I did it behind the scenes, but if you had basically an even ratio split here between the amount of Becic voters that ended up splitting for Peltola and those who split for Sarah Palin, and you had that same ratio applied to this number of 11,222, then that still wouldn't have been enough for Sarah Palin to actually beat Peltola. So at the end of the day, this is an extremely much more democratic system that we have in place here. And even if you had all of these people presumably following roughly the same ratio as the split here that we saw from Becic voters swinging for Peltola and Palin, then Peltola in all likelihood still would have won the election. But again, if they had all split for Sarah Palin, then Palin would have won this election. So this is why it's going to get kind of interesting when it comes down to the November elections, because you're still going to have these same 3 candidates. You're going to have Nick, you're going to have Sarah Palin, and then you're going to have Mary Peltola. And basically, if this guy Becic decides to side with Sarah Palin and goes and tells all of his voters to put her down as their second choice pick, then you could have a situation where Sarah Palin comes back in November and ends up winning this seat for the next 2 years. So, you know, if you're a Democrat and you support Mary Peltola, definitely not out of the woodwork there. And it's going to be a pretty interesting election campaign that's coming up. And then we had this other tweet here, which I think pretty much summarizes exactly why Republicans are coming out so feverishly against the idea of having ranked choice voting. So here from Tyler Bauer, he says, this is what we will have if you let ranked choice voting and independent redistricting commissions into your state. And he says Democrats in the national presidential election would have won 381 electoral votes to Republicans 157. So he's basically just saying the quiet part out loud here and saying, if we had a more democratic system here, if we didn't allow, you know, right-wing Republicans and reactionaries across the country to basically gerrymander the fuck out of their districts, usually along racial lines to disenfranchise minority voters, if we didn't allow them to do that, then Republicans would get absolutely wiped across the board. I mean, applying these two just basic, solid electoral reforms to our system here would result in Democrats winning Texas and, you know, reliably winning like Arizona and all these other swing states, Ohio and Pennsylvania and Georgia and even Tennessee here. So, I mean, honestly, they're just saying the quiet part out loud again. And this is why we need to be more aggressively pushing for something like ranked choice voting. And if there was one thing that I could give Andrew Yang credit for with the Forward Party, even though they don't seem to have a coherent policy agenda whatsoever, the one thing that they are aggressively pushing for is ranked choice voting. And this is why you need something like that put in place at the national level for many different reasons. Number one, and we saw this during this campaign between Sarah Palin and Becic and Peltola, is it significantly basically like calms down the rhetoric, because instead of having an incentive to go out and demonize the other side and, you know, portray, you know, if you're criticizing the Democrats, you're saying, oh, they're radical woke socialists or communists and they're trying to destroy the country, and Democrats attacking Republicans and saying, oh, they're just full-blown, you know, fascists and election deniers and whatever the fuck. It kind of gives you an incentive. Instead of having that extreme polarization where you're trying to demonize the other side, you actually have an incentive to try to also appeal to the other side's voters, because if they pick you as their second choice pick in ranked choice voting, then you could potentially end up winning the election if you manage to pull people from different coalitions within the election. So, I mean, it definitely gives an incentive to, you know, make appeals to a much broader coalition within these various elections. So that in and of itself is an absolutely amazing thing. But then on top of that, you also have the added benefit where you no longer have basically this narrative that can be put forward by Republicans or Democrats in terms of the so-called spoiler effect, right? This is what we heard in 2016 and 2020. If you voted for Jill Stein, then you cost Hillary Clinton the election. Well, if we had ranked choice voting in place, which most Democrats and most Republicans are against right now for very obvious reasons, because it would basically allow to break up the two-party duopoly that we have right now. If you had that in 2016, then you could have had motherfuckers who were voting for Jill Stein over Hillary Clinton, or people who were voting for like Gary Johnson over Donald Trump, and you could have had them still pick their preferred party, whether it's the Libertarian Party or the Green Party, put them as their first option, and then they could also, if they wanted to, put Democrats as their second option, and then when the Green Party or the Libertarian Party candidate doesn't make it through the first round, their votes would still go to that other candidate. So it basically completely takes away the entire narrative and the criticism that Democrats love to use on a regular basis that, oh, this is the more electable candidate and you're throwing away your vote if you're voting for a third party. It would completely eliminate that possibility. So at the end of the day, ranked choice voting is something we absolutely as leftists need to be aggressively pushing for and lobbying for, whether it's in, our various independent states, like clearly a state like Alaska flipping to be democratically controlled, with decades and decades of Republicans having basically a stronghold in this state. If we were able to do this in various states across the country, then it could open the door for more third parties. It could open the door for more leftist candidates to enter into these races and not have to face a lot of the polarization and a lot of the critiques coming from the establishments of the Democratic and the Republican parties. So, so many different positive reasons why you would have ranked choice voting put in place, but this is just one indication to show that, like, if you had a system like this put in place, if you ended gerrymandering, which, that guy Tyler Bauer was just freaking out about, if you ended gerrymandering and you applied ranked choice voting across the country, then yeah, these reactionary conservatives would basically get wiped across the board. And, you would also, again, open the door for a lot more third-party candidates. So the added benefits of having something like ranked choice voting are pretty fairly obvious, but that's also, again, why we're facing such significant pushback in terms of getting that at the national level from the Democratic Party, because they understand that would, significantly hurt their chances in maintaining this two-party duopoly and this corporate grip that we have on our political system here in the United States. So, this is why we got to break through this. So, whether it's in your own various independent states across this country or whether it's at the national level, this is something we seriously got to focus on, because ranked choice voting could dramatically change the landscape of how we operate within our so-called democracy in this country.